When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. If we're going to have free expression and productive public debates, we need to be free from coercion. That, at any rate, is one of the common themes among advocates for a healthier public sphere. A truly ideal public sphere is one where individuals engage in critical, rational debate without fear or force, exchanging ideas reasonably rather than in response to pressure or manipulation. Think of the ideal jury deliberation room, where the facts of the case have been laid out for everyone to assess, and everyone is free to engage in statements and counterstatements, while the collective jury arrives at a decision about guilt or innocence. If someone has been threatened ahead of time, or someone fears the consequences of a guilty verdict, the process is pretty well subverted. But coercion isn't just a political issue. In our personal lives, the same principle applies. Imagine you and your spouse are deciding how to spend your tax refund. Ideally, you each explain your reasons and weigh the merits of both options and reach a compromise, or choose one option. But what if one of you starts guilt-tripping the other? You never do what I like, or if you really cared about how I feel, you'd be more persuaded to my side of the issue. These emotional tactics can be coercive as well, applying real pressure rather than engaging in open, easy, respectful discussion. Emotional coercion can silence honest critique, just like political coercion can stifle dissent. Recognizing coercion in public and in personal contexts can help us steer conversations towards genuine understanding. In politics, this means pushing back against propaganda or intimidation. In relationships, it means calmly acknowledging manipulative language and hopefully redirecting the discussion back to the core issue. While achieving a completely coercion-free dialogue might be unrealistic, striving for open, respectful exchanges brings us closer to that ideal. And who knows, maybe we can all get a little bit better at arguing in both public and in private. Well, a boy can hope. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Martine Carcassonne. Martine is a professor of communication studies and the founder and director of the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University. The Center for Public Deliberation trains students to help the citizens of Northern Colorado have better discussions. Martine, tell us an argument story.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Michael. Basically, my argument story is kind of an argument I've been having with myself somewhat for the last 20 years about the work that I want to do and the work that our community needs. My initial academic training, similar to yours, was in rhetoric and argumentation. I really focused on, how do we have the tough conversations that we need to have? How do we deal with this inherent tension between kind of democracy and expertise? And overall, my work is hoping to find ways for people to have the tough conversations they need to have to address their shared problems better. My initial training was all about debate, and I ran debate classes. I was never on a debate team, but I taught those argumentation and debate classes. And I started getting a little bit more and more frustrated because, the better debaters always won, not necessarily the best argument, and going back and forth. But then I was doing a lot of work with Clinton's race initiative at the beginning of his second term. And part of that was they designed materials to help communities have better conversations about race. And that's actually what introduced me to dialogue and deliberation as these two kind of alternative tools to debate. And for a while, I kind of did what a lot of dialogue and deliberation people do, is I kind of became very anti-debate, right? Debate was bad, dialogue and deliberation was good. And I started kind of exploring that for quite a bit. But one of the best organizations that do this work is NCDD, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. And at their 2008 conference, give a shout out to Pete Bazumic from James Madison University, a communication professor who was a debater, had a presentation there of like, it should be NCDDD, right? that you've thrown out debate, right?
Okay.
And he did this brilliant job of showing these charts and diagrams that dialogue deliberation people would show, of that basically had like the downside of debate compared to the upside of dialogue and deliberation. And it was a great charge because it was basically you're deliberating really badly, right, by focusing on the downside of one side versus the upside of the other side. So that kind of created a shift And kind of going back to, the good debate can be really valuable, right? The problem, unfortunately, is most of our debate's horrible, right? Most of our debate's just a spectacle. Most of our debate is just, trying to find the 5-second clip that will go viral. Presidential debates, as scholars in our field have said, is just kind of dual press conferences. They're not actual debate. But that has led me to this point now. So a big project I'm working on of recognizing the importance of debate, dialogue, and deliberation as these key interactive communication tools that our campuses need, that our communities need, that don't happen naturally, right? And making a distinction between those three terms, recognizing, they each have a lot of upside, they each have some blind spots and some limits. But how do we kind of work together? Since it's so clear we need better conversations in our world,
Yeah.
how do we work better to kind of build capacity in our students, in our campuses, in our communities, to have some better conversations?
The potential downsides of debate are well known. So much of our modern world, whether it's these simulated press conferences as presidential debates, as you talk about, or online debates that are heated, or me debating with somebody who cut me off in traffic with one of my fingers, or whatever that is. But the potential downsides of dialogue or deliberation are not as obvious because they're not as hot, and they don't trigger our negativity bias quite as loudly.
Hmm.
But those can be places for manipulations, places for theater, places for simulation, the simulation that I understand you, but I'm really just fawning all over you to get you to shut up, or trying to get something out of you. And so let's back way up and talk about these three terms. At their best, what is dialogue? At its best, what is deliberation? At its best, what is debate?
Yeah. So the way I've been exploring this, and I can give you a link if people want to kind of look at this visually, but so I have a Venn diagram, which it's one of those things I drew first on a bar napkin at that 2008 conference, as someone was asking, hey, how do you make distinctions between these three? Yeah, so it's a Venn diagram with deliberation in the middle, and then debate and dialogue both overlap with deliberation, but they don't overlap each other. Right. And these are complex concepts. So these are my definitions. These aren't like the definitions, right?
Gotcha.
So I see debate as all three of them are interactive communication tools, which seems redundant, right? But so much of our political communication is actually one way, right? It's just people speaking out, giving talks, or people aren't actually engaging and going back and forth. So all three of these are about people going back and forth. Debate is all about, for me at its best, elevates good arguments and exposes bad arguments. So debate has rigor. Debate has expectations of quality. So when you have a really well-designed debate, an audience member should really kind of see where the best arguments lie, right? If you've got misinformation at debate, hopefully it gets called out, right? But again, most debates don't do that, because most debates are people kind of talking past each other, and the audience of most debates are there more for like a sporting event, right? They're there to cheer on their side and boo the other side, rather than think through, right? So that's one thing that we're doing, is really thinking about how do we create better debates that model the high quality debate that we need. And part of this is, one of the biggest problems we're dealing with right now. Scholars have called it information disorder, right? Like the amount of information we have now, our ability to create and share information has exponentially exploded. Our ability to make sense of information, to move from data and noise to hopefully knowledge and insight and ultimately wisdom, have not only not kept up, but in some ways has backtracked, right? Because we've lost faith in journalism and expertise, the institutions that help us do that, right? So debate becomes this really useful tool to help us make sense of all the noise that we're getting when done well.
It's a great summation of debate at its finest. Can you do the same for dialogue?
Yeah, so for me, for dialogue, so I talk a lot about the key challenges that we face. One's information disorder. The other one is toxic polarization and the division and the fragmentation, which is a huge problem, but it's also often exaggerated, right? We're not nearly as polarized as we think. There's a lot of bad faith actors that profit from our polarization, or kind of feeding us the outrage. So dialogue, whereas debate kind of deals with the information disorder, dialogue deals with this polarization fragmentation. Dialogue is interactive communication to connect with each other, to understand each other, hopefully to develop some mutual understanding, to develop some trust. But a key aspect of dialogue, particularly distinct from debate for me, is dialogue is non-judgmental, right? in a dialogue, I'm not supposed to say, no, actually, you're wrong, right? Because you're sharing your perspective, your lived experience. This is what's important to me. So dialogue is more about just understanding each other, right? It's kind of like brainstorming, right? We don't want to judge ideas. We just want to listen to each other. So dialogue is critical to undo some of the false polarization and to kind of heal ourselves and often to kind of rehumanize people, right? When we have these horrible caricatures of the other side. But dialogue isn't, by my definition, a decision-making model, right? If dialogue is non-judgmental, it kind of ends with the agreeing to disagree, which can be powerful for a conversation. But in a democracy, at some point, we can't just always agree to disagree. We have to make decisions together about how to face the problems that we face, right? So that takes us to deliberation, which kind of, at its best, deliberation brings the best of dialogue and debate. It brings the connection and the process and the social aspects of helping people come together across perspectives, but also has the rigor and the quality and the mechanism, hopefully, to elevate good arguments and expose bad arguments. So deliberation for me is this interactive communication about us having a conversation about what should we do, right? How do we act together to address the problems we're facing or to create something that we want to kind of create. And those conversations both need the trust and connection we can get from dialogue and the rigor and quality that we can get debate.
A couple
The
follow-ups
downside
on
deliberation, though, is it's resource heavy like crazy.
Right,
It takes a
right.
lot of time, whereas debate and dialogue are pretty easy to spark. Deliberation needs a lot of resources to do well.
A couple follow-ups
Yeah.
on these, and I appreciate that distinction. One debate addresses, as you say, information disorder. The other particularly addresses toxic polarization. Those two problems to me seem to work hand in hand. Toxic polarization is created by an information disorder and then is made all the more worse by each other. And so they're sort of mutually reinforcing. And so in that context, it seems pretty neat to say, well, if we're in a toxic polarization environment, then we recommend dialogue. If we're in an information disorder situation, we recommend debate. But those are always and everywhere the same in a hyper online world. So how do we parse out when one method is appropriate and when another is appropriate?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. They're very much it's a vicious cycle, right? They each kind of lead to each other.
Yeah.
And that's why, I mean, again, my center is the Center for Public Deliberation. I focus on deliberation because I certainly see the need for both, right?
Uh,
Um, and I see sometimes, my friends in dialogue, and there's, so much out there right now in the dialogue world and trying to kind of heal these divides. But one of the problems is when we overemphasize dialogue, right? Then we still need to make distinctions, right? This issue, a lot of glorification of open-mindedness, and
yeah.
even kind of going to free speech, right? We need free speech at the beginning. We need, not censor things. We need to kind of have a really big funnel. But the payoff of free speech is later on when we actually make distinctions between good arguments and bad arguments and make better decisions together. So if we focus so much on open-mindedness and we're saying, hey, everyone's perspective is just as good as everyone else's,
Right.
uh, that doesn't lead to very good decisions, right? So that's where we need to bring debate. But on the flip side, if we overemphasize debate, debate doesn't work when we have no trust and connection with each other, right? Facts don't work. Actually, some scary research that shows when we're polarized, facts can often backfire, right? The backfire effect kind of teaches us that in some situations where the better my argument, when I'm trying to convince someone who disagrees with me that we're polarized, the more they actually backfire, right? So debate doesn't work unless we have connections. The connections aren't enough for us to make decisions together. So how do we figure out how to build all three of these so we have more capacity in our communities and in our to have the deliberative conversations that we need to address our issues better.
Dialogue at its worst is perhaps overly permissive, overly forgiving, incapable of
Yeah,
making distinctions,
exactly.
and
Yeah,
then debate
yeah,
at its worst is overly exclusive, punitive, even repolarizing.
yeah. It's like even I talk a lot about toxic polarization as an issue and how we deal with it, and part of the response is, well, no, no, polarization isn't the issue. The issue is the other side in a way, right? And that's where when we focus completely on polarization, we're unable to make some distinctions. Some of the hardest things I'm really trying to work on now is I'm calling it the bad faith actor paradox, right?
Right,
But it's
right.
as an impartial facilitator, I'm trying to bring people together, but I also, care about things like good arguments and reality. So how do you deal with bad faith actors that are purposely, passing on misinformation and undermining things? Calling them out in a polarized environment doesn't tend to work, right? It's kind of like a conspiracy theory, right? They're self-sealing, right?
Uh,
Attacking the other side in a polarized environment just kind of fuels that narrative. Uh, but we can't just not call them out, right? So we're struggling with this tension between, um, you know, wanting kind of debate to matter and quality to matter, while also realizing when we're polarized, it's really hard to kind of take those things on well.
and talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your work in Northern Colorado, specifically with this question of you come into communities having difficult fights, difficult conversations about all sorts of matters, the environment, policing, you name it.
Mm.
And you sort of have to train students, and you do this work yourself to suss out, is the issue in this environment a kind of lack of consensus? Is this issue a lack of trust? Is a need for greater connection, greater understanding, a greater ability to parse out what is better information or a better way forward? Again, so you have to kind of like implement a dialogue-y approach or a debatey approach, I imagine. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my work is, and you've touched on this a couple times already, is really informed by social psychology and brain science, and
Mm,
this basic how we're wired, right? My initial training was in argumentation, which is like how we should argue. But I've also taken a lot of that persuasion classes and taught those classes in social movement classes, and
yeah.
recognize, what actually changes our minds are is rarely facts and logic, right? It's going to be more emotions, and there's these kind of negative quirks to human nature. So a lot of my work now, the heart of the CBD is how do we design processes that avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into their best. The problem is, as humans, we're not wired to deliberate. We're not wired to have the tough conversations we need to have to engage the inherent tensions and paradoxes that are relevant to all issues. We're susceptible to outrage, right? We love simple stories. We love our heroes and our victims and our villains. And then there's a lot of, especially a two-party system, but the media and social media are all very much kind of designed to more to divide us than bring us together, right? More to feed the simple narrative rather than to help us kind of deal with nuance. So my work is how do we design processes that flip that script, at least in a local community. So
Hmm.
yeah, one of the classes I teach every semester, I train students as facilitators. Going back to the downfall of deliberation is it's resource heavy. You need a lot of so my program, we've got 30 facilitators that are in a year-long program that I can show up. The city hires us, the county, school district, community organizations, we get written into grants. So we can turn a group of 100 people showing up to talk about an issue. And instead of them just one at a time at a microphone, kind of bad debate, talking past each other, we can develop some background material, research the issue, have some good important baseline of facts at the table, and then have someone trained to help people bring out the best in dialogue and debate, and actually have these tough conversations.
What do you think the most important skill that a facilitator can have is?
Hmm. That's a great question. We just actually had our all-day training on Saturday for our new students, right?
Oh,
And a big part, my work uses this concept of wicked problems, which is this idea of shifting from the easy story our brain wants to tell us that problems are caused by wicked people with
hmm,
bad values, to putting the wickedness in the problem. And what that means is recognizing that most of the tough issues we deal with inherently involve lots of underlying values that people care about. And what makes them hard is that different people rank those values differently, and prioritize them differently. And trying to honor one value like freedom inherently kind of pushes back on some other values, right? So when we the way we, from an outside facilitation perspective, we identify those values, put them on the table, and then help people have that tough conversation of how do we prioritize, how do we balance, ideally, how do we transcend and get creative and deal with these values differently. So that art of, as you're talking to someone, particularly if you disagree with them, to really figure out what's the positive motive here, right? What's
uh,
the thing that they care about that's really motivating their perspective? It actually ties, one of the famous conflict resolution books is Getting to Yes by Fisher and Ury from the Harvard Negotiation School, right? And they talk about moving from positions to interests. When people have positions, I want X, those are inherently zero sum, right? And it kind of, brings out the worst in human nature. We want to win. It's us versus them. But when you really ask people, why is that important to you? And you figure out the underlying motives, the underlying interests, there's always a lot more flexibility there to kind of work, right? So that's where my students are kind of trained to, how do we ask these questions, both to help people understand their own perspective, but then also open up space at that table. So we're engaging those tensions in a much more productive way.
So for going back to the kind of essential characteristics of excellence in facilitation, it sounds like, just to summarize, two of the most important suggestions you would make would be, one, a charity about the other person, and then second, an ability or perspective taking to see the world as they see it, or perhaps see the values that they are pushing for.
Yeah. We talk often that two of the most important skills for problem solving, particularly collaborative problem solving and just democracy, is listening and asking good questions.
Yeah.
And it's sad how we often don't explicitly teach those, right? We teach a lot of speaking classes and writing classes and, expressing yourself, but how often do we actually have, really dedicated coursework on here's how to listen and here's how to ask good questions? Because, a lot of this is pragmatic. If I really want to change people's mind, we know from the research that attacking them, demeaning them, telling them that they're evil doesn't work. It often backfires, right? But actually listening to them, taking them seriously, if anything, gives you a better insight of what they believe, while also creating a reciprocal relationship. If you take interest in what they actually believe and take them seriously, they're going to reciprocate that. And that's where we actually see in the research where people have their shifts, where they kind of change their mind, right? With someone actually listening to them versus someone attacking them.
As we close, I'd like to return to the initial debate, the 20-year debate, as you called it, that you've had with yourself. If I'm hearing you correctly, the kind of steps in this debate, and I'm curious about the resolution as you would characterize it, the steps seem to be debate is good, followed by, I don't know, maybe debate is not so good, followed by debate is good, but not by itself.
Yeah, I think it went from debate to debate bad, dialogue and deliberation good, to wait a second, debate made a little comeback, right? And then I'm recognizing no, we need all three of these have strengths and weaknesses, and we need capacity for each. And how do we build that up? And a big part of this, the work that I do with students, is the world needs facilitators. We need bridge builders, right? If everyone's an advocate, if everyone is fighting to win, our brains aren't working and we just kind of talk past each other. So how do we, with our communities, build more of these bridging institutions? How do we get students with more facilitation skills across debate, dialogue, and deliberation? So then we have the sort of communication we need to address our problems more productively.
Martin, thanks so much for being on When We Disagree.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for all the work you do.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.